For decades, I fooled myself into thinking that my blindness was irrelevant to my work and my worth. Only now, in my 80s, and in writing this memoir, have I finally come to accept my blindness as an essential part of who I am. Hello, this is Judge David Tatel. I am recently retired from 3 decades on the United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, generally known as the nation's second highest court. And you're listening to White Canes Connect.
Hey there, PA Federationists. Welcome to another episode of White Canes Connect, presented by the National Federation of the Blind of Pennsylvania. My name is David Goldstein. I am your first vice president. Joining me today is co-host and White Canes Connect creator, Lisa Bryant. Lisa, how are you?
I am very well, David, and this is a very exciting show. We have the very esteemed Judge David Tatel, author of Vision. He served on the nation's second highest court, the D.C. Court of Appeals, for over 30 years. But even with that great accomplishment, he shares in his memoir, he's very candid, very transparent about years and years and years of hiding his blindness, being ashamed of his blindness. He went through great lengths to make sure that it was not in any materials about him, and how the book has helped him to come to terms with it.
It's funny how, as you get older and you do certain things, you start to realize things. And a couple of the things that I like that the judge said in the episode, it's something that I did even this morning when I was in Philadelphia going to Will's Eye, listening and following somebody's footsteps.
Mhm.
And when somebody walks at the right speed, it is so nice for me to just hop behind them and just keep going. If they're walking too slow, I go around. But and it's just one of the tools that you can use, and the judge talks about some other things that he has used over the years, and it really is something that when you listen to him speak, and some of you may remember him, he was at the national convention last year in Orlando being interviewed, and that's what put him on our radar. So we
Yes.
talk about the book, and Lisa, I know you've read the book from cover to cover. It is available on Bard. It is also available on Audible and Amazon and so forth. So you can find it there, and I'll put a link in the show notes to it on Amazon. And Lisa, I know you really enjoyed it. I know I still have to read the whole thing.
It's a great read, but you'll get some snippets of it from Judge Tatel because he does read some excerpts. So let's listen.
Judge Tatel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me. Glad to be here.
Judge Tatel, when we heard you speak at our convention last year in Orlando, David and I sort of finished one another's sentence and we said, we have got to have him on. So
Yes.
this has been on our radar for some time, and it is really a pleasure to speak with you directly. And we will talk about your very engaging book, which I just completed, called Vision. But there are definitely, you and David have some things in common. David also used the technique of listening for a woman's heels when he's in the airport. And he also has been frustrated by the delay at live sports. So we can kvetch about that later as well. And David is our Newsline contact and for Pennsylvania. And I know how a big fan you are of Newsline.
Yep.
We wanted you to share the line that you read before the greeting because I think it just really is a great example of how honest and transparent this memoir is. The book is a story of your judicial career, your struggle with accepting your blindness, but it's also a love story. But going back before even all of that, tell us how you knew or what's the story behind finally coming to the decision that you needed to, it was time to write this journey.
I'm going to answer that question in just a minute. Could I just read the full passage from which that sentence comes from? This is from the prologue of the book, and the sentence I read at the beginning is from this paragraph. But I'd like your listeners to hear the whole paragraph because I think it will give them a good sense of the book. I've lived a rich and varied life as a civil rights lawyer, as a federal judge, as a husband of 60 years, as a father of 4, as a grandfather of 8, and now as a great grandfather. I've spent my professional career in the pursuit of justice, and I could have written a memoir entirely about that pursuit. But unlike most lawyers and judges, I've been blind for over half my life due to a rare inherited eye disease called retinitis pigmentosa. Throughout my 30 years on the nation's second highest court, the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, I could neither read a word of the thousands of legal briefs submitted to my court, nor see the faces of the hundreds of lawyers who argued before me. A blind judge sounds like a cliche, I know, like the statue of Lady Justice, wearing a blindfold and holding her scales. But it's no cliche to me. I can't see, but I can listen closely. I didn't need to see the lawyers to hear their argument, and I absorbed all the written materials by having them read to me or later by using digital audio devices. For decades, I fooled myself into thinking that my blindness was irrelevant to my work and my worth. Only now, in my 80s and in writing this memoir, have I finally come to accept my blindness as an essential part of who I am. This memoir is about my life in the law and my journey into blindness. It's also about the Supreme Court and my grave concerns about the state of our judiciary. You asked about why I wrote this book. I actually had no plans. I retired last year from the court. I had served on it for 30 years. I had a 30-year law practice before that. I hadn't intended to write a memoir, but I didn't want to write a book. I didn't think anybody would want to read a book by a federal judge who never got to the Supreme Court. And I certainly didn't want to write a book about being blind. But friends of mine who knew me and knew my career really thought I should think about it. They thought my story might be inspirational. And so I thought about it a lot and concluded that I would give it a try, but that I wanted to write a book about both being blind and my views about the courts and why those are related to each other. And so I got started, and one thing led to another. And after 3 years, I finished this book, which I wrote along with the book is my memoir, but it's also, as you pointed out, a memoir of my wife, Edie, and me, and our lives together. And fortunately for me, my wife, Edie, is also a very good writer. And so she was my writing partner, which was great because this is a story, this is a life we both lived. And so working together, we were able to tell the story together.
You were talking about the timing, and the book is primarily about your time on the DC circuit, but as you mentioned, you had quite a career before that, but it wasn't always law. Law was not your initial goal, correct?
Correct. I started
So
out as a scientist.
yeah. So tell us about that transition. What's the story behind that change in direction, and what also ended up being what ignited your passion for
Yeah,
civil rights and equal justice?
right. Well, my father was a physicist, scientist, and he involved me in his work. Even as a little boy, he took me to his lab all the time. And as a kid, I was fascinated with science. And he took me even on his scientific expeditions, including in 1957, a 1.5 month trip to the Peruvian Altiplano. I was just 15 years old. And so science was part of my life. I like to say that growing up in my father, Howard Tatel's house was like growing up in a science fair project because there were experiments everywhere. So when I went off to the University of Michigan, I was majoring in physics and math and engineering. This was 1960, and my plan was to be a scientist, but it was the 1960s, the civil rights movement, then later the environmental movement, the women's movement, the anti-war movement, and I was captured by the 60s and and fascinated with them and personally involved in all of those issues. And by the time I was in my second year at Michigan, I decided that although I love science, I really wanted to be, an active player in the world. And I was an admirer of all the civil rights lawyers in the South. I wanted to be like them. And so I switched to political science so that I could go to law school. And at least for David Tatel, the rest is history. I
Mhm.
went off to the University of Chicago Law School and for for about 30 years had civil rights jobs both in the private sector in a law firm, in private civil rights organizations, nonprofits, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and during the Carter administration as head of the Office for Civil Rights of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. But throughout that entire time, I kept up my interest in science. It was a hobby, not a profession.
You had mentioned that you went on this 6-week trip to Peru, and I remember hearing that it was around the time you were 15 that you noticed your vision was decreasing. Was it on that trip that you noticed it, or was it after that
Oh, no,
trip?
no, it was way before that.
Okay.
When I was a little kid, I had trouble seeing at night. And, everybody always said, well, David has night blindness. And no one knew what that meant. I mean, they took me to, I mean, this was, in the 1940s. And they took me to some clueless ophthalmologists who said things like, well, yeah, it's hard to see in night. It's dark. And there were some doctors who thought, well, he should eat carrots. So I ate a lot of carrots. But not until 1957, when I was 15, my mother got increasingly worried about it, and she took me to NIH. That was before there was even a National Eye Institute. National NIH had an eye clinic in it, and that's where they diagnosed the RP. I
Okay.
was 15, and at that point, it was tricky to see at night, and also I was noticing peripheral vision problems. But I was functioning. If you just watched me, I was functioning as a sighted kid. I played baseball, ran around with my friends, read books.
Mhm.
So I looked like a normal sighted person.
And you lived that way, sort of masking your vision
Mhm.
life for many, many, many
Yeah,
years.
undercover. Right.
Yeah. Right. So tell us more about, I guess that, but what never diminished was your career goal. You
Right.
kept striving in your law career. So tell us more about that, I guess, the tension of not wanting your blindness known, and we can talk even about some of the lengths that you went through to hide it. But the tension between, just still being very driven, but dealing with this pesky situation of not wanting others to know that you had a vision problem.
Yeah. Well, when I was 15, I wasn't driven professionally. I was just a kid. And I just didn't tell my friends or anybody else about it. Kids want to be like, their friends. So I hid it for as long as I could. Yes, by the time I got to law school and started practicing law, I worried at that point that my declining vision would hurt me professionally. And so, I hid it, developed all kinds of workarounds. This was before the Americans with Disabilities Act. There were no protections for people with disabilities. I didn't have any blind role models. And so, I worried that it would hurt me professionally. And, as a kid and then as an adult, I have to say, looking back on it and trying to recreate how I was thinking, think there was some shame, some embarrassment that I had something wrong with me. I wanted to read the paragraph about some of my tricks. This is back 15-year-old David. And I explained, I came home and I told no one about my RP. This is from chapter 2. I told no one about my RP and developed lots of tricks to cover up my declining sight. For example, going to movies with friends was tricky. I could get to my seat just fine when the lights were on. But if I went for popcorn after the lights dimmed, I had to count the seats sideways, then the rows up and down, to have any chance of making it back to the right spot. Somehow, I feared my friends' judgment about my declining vision more than the decline itself. Like most kids, I just wanted to be normal. And I thought my friends would think less of me if they knew what was going on. So I began building a repertoire of cover up strategies. Instead of saying to my friends, I can't see the ball, I made up excuses like, can't believe I missed that one, as if being a lousy ball player were better than being a poorly sighted one. And on and on and on. And I talk about in the book the other techniques I use to cover it up. Some of them are funny, some of them are looking back on them kind of sad.
Now, you actually went through some great lengths when you were a lawyer, a justice to hide
Right,
your vision loss. Tell us about some of those. I remember one that you didn't even want it mentioned in any announcements about you or press releases about your
right,
appointment. You even went to remove it from your Wikipedia page?
right. Yes. So, by the time I was 35, my eyesight declined really quite dramatically. And so I couldn't hide it anymore. I went for 4 or 5 years without a cane, but then I got a cane and I used the cane for almost 30 years before I got my guide dog, Vixen. But throughout that time, I never talked about blindness. I say in the book, I wanted to be, I didn't want to be thought of as a blind judge. I wanted to be thought of as a judge who happened to be blind. And so, I never talked about it. And until the point when I started actually using someone to help me get around, I had lots of tricks for getting around on my own. Like, following women with high heels was really
Yeah.
very, very helpful. It was a good one. I still do that, by the way.
Mm.
Just in fact, there's Vixen. Okay, Vixen got reported. I mean, just the other day, for example, Vixen and I were walking from the courthouse. I was at a meeting at the courthouse back to the metro. And she really knows the route, but we actually hadn't been there for a few months. And as we were walking down a long sidewalk that goes between two buildings, and that building, um, that sidewalk, hi Nixon, that sidewalk ends up crossing a road where there's a lot of traffic and a stop sign. And I was pretty sure I knew where I was because she felt pretty confident. But fortunately for me, 15 feet ahead, there was a woman walking with pretty hard heels. So that gave me the confidence. Here I am all these years later, still doing it. Worked great.
Mhm, mhm.
So
That's not a bad workaround.
it works fine.
But, that also brings to mind the many resources that you have used along the way, like
Yeah.
a reader, always
Yeah.
having a reader to help you. I wonder, because you talk a lot about it kinda sound like it could get a little ugly, the process of selecting law clerks,
Yeah.
and there were very there were the criteria was very specific, very precise. What about when you needed readers? What did you look for in a good reader?
Well, I used readers for a long time, but I didn't get really good at it until I got on the court. And I hired all my readers were college graduates who wanted to go to law school. I didn't want anybody who wasn't going to law school. The year would be wasted on someone who wasn't going to law school. And I wanted someone who was excited about the work. And I'd say for my first 10 or 15 years, I hired just really smart college graduates. But halfway through, I hired one of my readers who turned out to be one of my best evers, was a college debater. He was a debate champion. He'd won the national debate championship, in fact. He was so good. I said to him, hey, I want you to replace yourself. And so every year, my clerks found my next reader from the college debating community. And debating is good for a couple of reasons. First of all, it really hones your intellectual skills. And also, debaters speak fast, so they were fast readers.
Mhm.
Yeah,
That's one of those little fun facts that we wouldn't have known about. But again, going back to your work as a judge and your daily routine, having your readers, and of course, by now I'm sure, using more technology. What about some of the cases that maybe they were a little too close to home? I think you talk about a couple of those that you actually had to recuse yourself from. Talk more about just working as a judge?
Yeah. Well, I was an appeals court judge, so we didn't have juries. We were hearing legal arguments from lawyers arguing about decisions either by a district judge, that's the trial court, or by an administrative agency. So my court worked just like the Supreme Court. Two lawyers standing up arguing before, in the case of my court, a panel of three judges. And so they're legal arguments. And although I had, vast amount of written material to read, I was able to get through it with my readers at the beginning, but by the end, I was able to read almost all of it myself because of technology.
Mhm.
But I it took me a little longer than the cited judges, I think, to prepare for a case. But still, I was able to keep up with the work, and I just adjusted to it the way all blind people do. Sure, it's a little more difficult, but with the help of readers and mostly technology and very helpful colleagues, I was able to handle the job pretty well, I thought.
And what about when your blindness prevented you from being completely impartial?
Oh, well, okay. You're asking about the case where I recused myself. I didn't recuse myself because I couldn't be impartial. In fact, well, let me just tell you the facts of the case. Some of my blind friends think I shouldn't have recused myself, by the way. In fact, one of the lawyers at the National Federation meeting came up to me and said, "I really love your book, but you shouldn't have recused yourself from that case."
Mhm.
So this was a case involving the statute that requires the Treasury Department to make currency accessible to the blind. And of course, Treasury's done nothing for years. And so the a lawsuit was filed, and it ended up in my court, and I was on the panel. And the question was, should we order the Treasury Department, issue an injunction to order the Treasury Department to do what the statute required? I didn't have any doubt at all. I felt pretty strongly about this issue. This was back in the days when, this was before cell phones and things like that. And, I still had, like everybody, paper money in my pocket. And, I had to keep my currency organized. But every once in a while, I wasn't sure what was there. And sometimes I'd have to say to a cab driver, "Is this a 10?"
Yeah.
I found that embarrassing. And I was really annoyed that my government couldn't do what every other country on the planet has done, which is to make current paper currency accessible. So I felt strongly about this case, but I didn't have any doubt that I could apply the law objectively, which is my responsibility as a judge.
Mhm.
But I worried that the public might question my impartiality.
Mm.
And and you know, courts courts we aren't elected, and people obey our decisions and the government obeys them because they think they flow from the application of law to fact, not from any personal views. And I didn't want the public to think, even though I think this was unreasonable, the public to think that a court had ordered the Treasury to spend millions and millions of dollars making currency accessible to the blind when one of the judges on the panel was blind. Now, someday we'll get to the point where I won't worry about that anymore. We'll get to the point where the public will think, well, of course he won't decide it that way, right? But we're not there yet, unfortunately. And so I wanted to protect the integrity of my court. And so I recused myself. Recuse means decided not to sit on the case. So another judge took my place.
You talk about being impartial, and it's not involving the book, but can a blind person get a fair if for whatever they're accused of something, can a blind person get a fair trial? I've tried to sit on a jury and was given the what for, how you gonna check this, how you gonna see that, how you gonna do this, both by the attorneys and by the judge himself in one instance. So can if I go out and whatever I do wrong, could I get a fair trial? Because there's not gonna be any blind people on that jury
Well,
because neither side is gonna.
first of all, there are lots of courts that do allow blind people to serve on juries. So that's you had a bad judge.
Mhm.
I mean, I know in our courts in DC, there have been blind jurors. But yeah, I think our judicial system's most of the time pretty good. And I don't see any reason why a blind person can't get a perfectly fair trial. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, let's assume. I suppose it depends on what the crime is. Assume, assume, David, that you robbed a bank. Okay. No, forget
That
that.
would be something.
Assume that you forget robbing a bank. Assume that you committed. Let's assume you're an accountant
Okay.
and you stole some money through the accounting process. That doesn't have anything to do with you being blind. You could get a, you could get a perfectly fair trial there.
Okay.
So I don't really worry about that. I do think there are, if there are, I suspect there are lots of courts like the one you tried, you were, you were exposed to that wouldn't take blind jurors. But we need to get courts to do that. That's the answer. But it can't be that a blind person is entitled to have a blind juror. That's not the way it works.
What about times, or I should say cases, where you have had to defend yourself because someone challenged your ability to be a fair
Well,
justice,
that's never happened to me.
good.
No, nobody's the closest it came.
I thought it
eh,
was that one case, but go
Yeah,
ahead. I'll
I'm
let
about to
you.
tell you that. I'm
Mhm.
about to tell you. Good, you read the book carefully. Thank you. Yeah, I'm about to tell you that one case. So this was a case involving a performance artist. I didn't know much about performance art, but this guy, his performance art was he created images of US currency that looked exactly like the real thing.
Yeah.
And then he'd go into a store and he'd use this currency to buy a toaster. And then as soon as he paid for it, he said to the clerk or the owner of the store, by the way, this isn't real money. And then he'd give him real money. But his purpose was to bring art out of the out of the museum and into the streets. All right. So the Treasury Department, the Secret Service, was not pleased with this. And so they were investigating him, and he claimed they thought he was counterfeiting money. He claimed he had a First Amendment right to do this. The case came before us, and I was on that panel. And the way I prepared, so we had to decide. One of the things we had to decide, we didn't, and this wasn't the way we ended to decide the case, but to prepare for it, I had to have a pretty good sense of, how much did these images look like real money? How much did one of his $5 bills look like a real $5 bill? Well, that day, my daughter, who was then, I think, a freshman in college, happened to be in the courthouse. And she spent a couple of hours with me going over the bills, using my finger, and we talked about it. And I had a pretty good sense by the time that was over about it. So then we heard the case. Well, and we ruled against him, but not not because the money was the same. It turned out not to be relevant to the case. But he was quoted in the newspapers or the New Yorker or some places saying something like, for God's sake, there was a blind judge on the panel, maybe even had a guide dog. Well, I thought that was really insulting.
Mhm.
But, now that I look back on it, having written the book and thought about it a lot, I think I probably should have recused myself in that case. I probably shouldn't have heard the case because, as offensive as that man was, there are a lot of people who probably felt that way. And so, to protect the integrity of my court, I probably shouldn't have served on it. But going back to the other case, just like that other case I mentioned, someday that'll be irrelevant.
Yeah.
Someday there won't be idiots like that who say, "Oh my gosh, how could a blind judge decide a case?" Someday the public will understand there's no problem, right? That's where we hope to get.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, a long career like yours, you have had some very impressive, I should say, meetings and people you've met, cases you've been involved in. Tell us about some of those. I know you met President Kennedy. I don't know what gets a little higher than that, but just share some of those moments that you'll always kind of remember and cherish.
I was a junior at the University of Michigan. I was one of thousands of summer clerks. College students. College students had summer jobs. The Kennedy administration brought 10,000 college students to Washington each summer and gave us
Mm,
jobs.
mm.
They wanted college students to understand that working for government was a noble thing to do. Doesn't that sound old fashioned? Yeah. And so I had a friend whose father was in the cabinet, and he arranged for us to meet Ted Sorensen, who was the president's chief speechwriter. And 4 of us were sitting in Ted Sorensen's office hearing about his work, and there was a knock on the door, and in walked John F. Kennedy, the president of the United
Oh.
States. And he chatted with us for a couple minutes and shook our hands, and then he said, "I need Ted." So that was the end of it. But he also greeted us, all of us, at the beginning of the summer and the end of the summer on the White House lawn. So I was greatly influenced by President Kennedy and his emphasis on public service.
Mm.
And, it's really what led to my career in the law and the work I did. In the last 2 chapters of the book, well, the last chapter of the book is called The Dog That Changed My Life, and that's about Dixon. But the 2 chapters before that are about my views of the court in 2 different areas. One is a chapter called The Future of the Planet, where I talk about the big environmental cases that I decided and that the court decided. And then the next chapter is called The Future of Our Democracy, where I talk about voting rights cases because I decided a lot of those in the Supreme Court. And my thesis in those 2 chapters is that, the Supreme Court itself is a threat to our democracy because, by abandoning principles of judicial restraint, it's still slowly increasing its own power at the expense of the elected branches of government. And I think that's very dangerous for a democracy.
So you have retired, I think you said last year, correct? Or
I
before?
retired just a little over a year ago. Mhm.
Yeah. So now you have penned your memoir, you've come to terms with your blindness, and you even sort of give a charge at the end of the book of what we can do, citizens, law students, to sort of keep that passion for equal justice and for fighting for civil rights. But what for you, Judge Tatel? What are you doing now? How do you continue your own personal fight?
Well, I'm spending a huge amount of time doing just this, still talking about the book. I have lots of book talks ahead of me. I've had many, many at law schools, law firms,
I think you were
bookstores.
here in Philadelphia and we missed you.
I was. I
Yeah.
was at the that wonderful
Free library?
free library. I love that. That was
Yeah.
so great. Yeah. So I do that, and I use that as an opportunity to talk about the law and my concerns about the Trump administration and what's happening in our country, and encourage people to vote.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I'm doing. I'm also back at my old law firm
Mhm.
doing a
You're
little bit
doing pro
doing
bono?
a little bit of pro bono work. Yep.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Another book in the making,
No, no more
perhaps? No?
books. No, no. I mean, there'll be a paperback,
Okay,
and
yeah.
when the paperback comes out, I'm gonna write a foreword,
Mhm,
which does 2 things. 1, it will update my views about the courts, and right now, I think the threat to our democracy comes more from the president than it does from the Supreme Court,
mhm.
and I would explain why. The other thing I would write about in the prologue is what a profound effect on me writing this memoir was. When I started this, I thought you just told your story, but it turns out that for me, it was very profound. And in fact, writing the book, I say in the prologue that the book is the coda to my adventure. That,
Yes.
but for writing this book, I would never have come to terms with my blindness. And of course, Vixen played an important role in that also. So I would write about that. But the other thing I would write about is how surprised I am about the hundreds of emails I've had since the book came out from people who say, I read Vision and it tells my story too.
Mhm.
And I am stunned to realize that I wasn't the only one hiding my declining sight, that that's what most people did. And I mean, I even had a letter, a note a couple months ago from a law student who said she still counts seats in the theater. I was, yeah. And it's not just blind people. I have letters from people who are losing their hearing, people who had depression, people had all kinds of things who did what I did, who hid it, and to me that's kind of a revelation and a bit of a relief because I thought when I was doing this it was only me. I thought there was something wrong with me. Turns out I was just being a human being.
It sounds like this was a relief
Oh
and
yeah,
sort of cathartic for you as well.
yeah.
So, Judge Tatel, how can we, people in the blind community, How can we get past that shaming of ourselves, do you think?
Boy, that's a really hard question. I mean, it's easy now for me to look back on it and say we should just be honest
Mhm.
and not be ashamed of it. That's easy to say in retrospect, right?
Yeah.
It's very hard to say when you're 15 years old. I mean, I remember a year or two ago, through a family friend, I was asked to speak to a young man who was, he was 19 or 20 years old. He was in college. He had RP. He's sort of the same age I was, and he was hiding it too. And I told him that, based on my own experience, I thought he should be honest and open about it. But it's really hard
Yeah.
to say that. And it's not hard to say it. I understand why he was reluctant to do it. So I don't think I know the answer. I do think that the situation now is different than it was when I was a kid. There was no Americans with Disabilities Act
Right.
then. There were no blind role models. Maybe my book will help people.
Mhm.
I hope maybe people will read my book and see, hey, if there had been a blind judge on a court of appeals when I was in law school,
That's
would I have
right.
hidden it? I don't
Yeah.
know. But now at least law students with visual disabilities can read my book and see that for 30 years, a blind judge was on the DC circuit, right?
Mhm.
Maybe that will help them acknowledge it.
We hope so as well.
Yeah.
We hope so as well. Again, I wanted you and David to talk about Newsline because, as I said earlier, David is our contact here in Pennsylvania, and we know that you are big Newsline. Are you still reading I think you
Ah,
said a couple
David,
of hours a
I
day?
wish David and I should have a contest. See who uses Newsline more, right? I mean,
I love the Wall Street Journal on there. First of all, when you do any of this stuff, and people say, "Oh, well, I can get that on I can just go to the website." Yeah, you can go to the website, but you have the ads and you hear the knocking and the ads messing up voiceover when you go through. And when you do it through Newsline on your iPhone, you just read right through it. There's no issues and
yeah.
it's clear as day.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I love it. Now, I do most of my Newsline reading on a Victor reader. I started using a Victor reader long before I started to use an iPhone. And so the Victor reader is kind of it's kind of part of my brain. Frankly, the voice is awful, and the voice on the iPhone is much better. And the Victor reader is still pretty clunky. Even do you use a Victor reader, David?
I don't know. I use the phone.
Yeah, you don't need the Victor reader. You're probably better with the phone than I am. But the other reason why I like the Victor reader is I can use it when I'm working out. It's very hard to do the tapping and swiping when you're on a exercise machine, whereas with the Victor reader, it's buttons. And so I probably spend at least 2 hours a day on the newspapers
Um,
alone.
yeah.
And when my Victor reader doesn't work or when I'm just sitting around, sometimes I prefer to use the iPhone because the quality of the voice is so much better.
Mhm.
But either way, I love it, and I use Newsline for magazines and newspapers. All my magazines I get from Newsline.
We didn't even get a chance to touch on the many iterations of technology that you have seen, like going back to the talking books,
Oh,
which
yeah.
I think were albums, right?
They
Am I
were
correct?
records. They were records. They looked like they were sort of halfway between a 33 and a 78,
Yeah,
Huh.
and they
that is
came in a big
incredible.
box, and you put them on a turntable.
Wow.
But at the time, it was innovative, right?
It was totally great. I loved it. I would sit around with this boxy record player and, I had little children at the time, and we'd listen to Goodnight Moon together.
Mm.
Now, you haven't asked me about my dog.
We definitely talk about Vixen.
I tell the story at the end of the book. By the way, the book is called Vision, a memoir of blindness and justice. And, you can get it from any bookstore. They all have them. And you can also get it on Amazon. And there's an Audible version that's free on Bar. So I read the prologue and the acknowledgments. And an actor friend of mine reads the rest of the book. Okay. So anyway, I tell the story of Vixen in the last chapter, which is called The Dog That Changed My Life. I used a cane until my mid 70s. And I really had no plans to get a guide dog. One of the reasons was, do either of you have a guide dog?
No.
We have
Okay.
a pet dog, but he
Oh,
is nowhere near a
yeah.
working
So
animal.
one of the reasons why is I was doing fine with my cane, and also, for the guide dog programs, you have to go there for a month to learn to use the dog, and I wasn't going to be able to do that. But anyway, to make a long story short, my then 11-year-old grandson Ruben showed up one day with this podcast he wanted me to listen to. It was about one of the guide dog programs. And at the end, it said, if you're too busy to come here, we could bring the dog to you. Well, I never heard that. So, I talked to my wife about it and we decided, hey, look, why don't we try, see what happens? And so I applied. I applied to Fidelco Guide Dog Foundation in Connecticut because they don't have a facility. They only train you where you live. That's their theory. And I thought that was really
And that
helpful.
makes sense.
And I knew two Fidelco Guide Dog owners, and they only trained German Shepherds. That's it. So after a year, I got accepted, and they showed up with this. My trainer showed up with this beautiful 2-year-old German Shepherd named Vixen. And after 2 weeks of intense training, he left us alone. And it's been 5.5 years, and she's completely changed my life because I have so much independence I never had before. And so does my wife, because I like to go on really long walks here in the country, and I used to have to go with her, but now Vixen and I go. The other thing she's done is, I said writing the book helped me come to terms with my blindness. Well, Vixen has too, because when I people don't stop me when I had a cane and say, "Hey, how does that cane work?" No, but if you have a guide dog, everybody wants to talk about the dog. I was on the metro just yesterday, coming home from the courthouse, and I was standing next to the door, and this man tapped me on my shoulder. He says, "Do you mind if I ask you a question?" And I said, "No, no." He said, "How is she going to get you? Is she going to really get you out of the train and up onto the platform?" So my point about this is happens all the time. You can't have a guide dog and be uncomfortable talking about blindness. So I love to talk about her and I love to explain to people what she's done for me. And that's helped me be more comfortable with talking about blindness.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, look how you've come around from
Yeah,
hiding it and would I
right,
should say even desperately trying to hide it. So now it's your
right.
platform.
Yeah, right. It's completely different. It's great.
Yeah.
Have you had any issues with, "Hey, you can't bring that dog in here," type of
Oh,
No. Oh,
the Lyft ride.
once
Yeah.
in a restaurant, some maitre d' was suspicious. And my wife is my she but that was fine. The worst experience I ever had was in an Uber,
Yeah.
but
Was it
everybody with
Uber or
guide dogs.
Lyft?
Right.
And this was Lyft, and I
Mhm.
tell the story in the book.
Yeah.
You read the story. I mean,
That's what I thought you were going to share, not
but
the restaurant.
yeah, but
I
it
thought the
backfired. Yeah, he wouldn't let me in the car, and it backfired because I went back to the courthouse and called my friends at the Washington Post, and a
he
week
had the
later, the
wrong one.
Banner headline, "Lyft rejects federal judge and his guide dog."
Yeah.
It's really awful. You wanna I'll tell you a funny story, though. Last couple of months ago, we were in San Francisco. I have a daughter who has, 2 boys who lives there, and we were downtown with the 13-year-old, and we decided to take a Waymo. Those are the driverless cars?
Right.
They're great because 'cause they'll take your dog. They don't ask questions. That's our future.
Well, Judge Tatel, it was an honor to have you on. Thank you for making the time, and,
Glad to talk to you.
yes, all the best to you and
Thank you.
your work going forward.
Good, thank you very much, and I enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks again to Judge Tatel for coming on and talking about the book, as well as getting so excited while he was talking about Vixen, his guide dog. And Lisa, I never knew that there were guide dog schools that will bring the dog to you. Not that Ziggy would ever allow that for me, but I thought that was interesting.
And it makes sense. The dogs should be trained in the environment where they're going to be working, so it really does make sense. So the book, I must say, I highly recommend it. It's educational, it's entertaining, he has a very wry sense of humor. Like he mentioned, it's about the law. It's very detailed about his blindness journey and the struggles along the way. And it's also a love story. He has a very devoted wife, Edie. I think they've been married for over 60 years, and she was just as much a part of this book and his life as they just walk this together, and he gives such loving tribute to her.
As he was talking about that part where she helped in the writing of the book, I just imagined Liz and I writing a book and saying, "Don't you remember that?" "No, I don't." And I could
Well,
just imagine the back and forth there.
yeah, and actually that's another good point. So he also in the book shares some things that he never told her when they happened, like some falls that he covered up. But as they were writing this together, he had to all came out. And so they had a little there was a moment. I'll just leave it at that. That's a moment. But it is a very good read. And even though Judge Tatel talks about his concern at the direction our courts are taking, I think with the work that he's doing now, he mentioned how he's doing a lot of pro bono work. So he is still very much in the game or in the fight. And I think that's a good takeaway for any of us to not be discouraged. And there's always something that we can do from wherever we are or what position we're in. Even if you're not a law student or pursuing a career in law, you can stay very engaged civically. There's so many different ways that we can all do our part.
Again, the book is called Vision. It's available at just about any bookstore you want, Amazon and Audible and whatnot. But you can also listen on Bard. Of course, it doesn't help the author when you listen there, but it will help you if you do listen there. So check it out. And if you have read it already or you're interested in reading it, we'd love to hear from you. Please give us a call, 267-338-4495. You've got up to 3 minutes. Leave your name and town if you do leave a voicemail and tell us what you think. If you're going to law school or you've read it and you now want to go to law school, we'd love to hear from you.
And you can also email us. The email address is whitecanesconnect@gmail.com.
Lisa, this was a very interesting episode. And as we talked about in the episode, he came on our radar at the convention last year, and I'm glad
Yeah.
we finally were able to get him on.
Yes, good show. And thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks for listening. Take care.